Dadoosh! How's it, everybody? Capono here. Today I am going to break down a few of the different things about rods that make one rod different from another rod, different from another rod, different from those rods over there. By breaking down these different things and understanding a little bit more about rods, you're gonna have a little bit better understanding when you're out there either trying to buy a rod, or maybe you have some rods that are just hanging out in your garage, you wanna pick up fishing, and you have no idea, like, okay, what kind of rod is this? What do I do with this thing? Hopefully by the end of this video, you're gonna have a whole bunch more knowledge that you can take out into the world and utilize in your everyday fishing lives. So I have a bunch of rods here. Some of them, these ones right here, my kind of everyday rods. And then we have a whole bunch of rods that I literally just found maybe 20 minutes ago laying around here in this garage. These are ours family's old rods. I don't know pretty much anything about the history of these. I don't know what kind of rods these are, but by breaking down these components I'm gonna teach you about right now, we're gonna be able to tell a little bit about these rods and what you wanna do with these things. So the two main things I wanna explain in this video are rod action and rod power. In combination, your rod's action and your rod's power with your rod height being the most simple thing to understand, it's just how high your rod is, will make your rod act a certain way. So understanding the action and the rod power will help you to understand what your rod is gonna do when you're actually out there and using it. In Hawaii, we kind of use action and power interchangeably. Someone might be talking about the action and using the terms of power or vice versa. I'm just going off of the official like rod building terminology here. So if you understand this, you'll understand pretty much what anybody's talking about when they're talking to you about what action is your rod, what's your rod like, what power is it, things like that. First thing you might be asking me is, well, how do I know what type of action, what type of power my rod is? Most rods out there nowadays print that information for you right here on the base of the rod, right by where your reel sits. Boom. So let's take a look at this Okuma, the ladies editions ours rod, which I've kind of been stealing for myself. It talks about the rod right here. This is a 9-foot rod, M, medium action. It doesn't talk about the power itself, but the power infers the next line down, which is the pound test you're gonna run and the amount of ounces that you can cast. That is where the power comes in. Some rods will directly tell you what power it is. Some rods won't tell you what action it is. Every single company out there defines power and action on their own. There's no center board deciding this is medium action, this is light, this is, you know, it's up to every company to define what is medium, what is light, all that different stuff. So just understanding the terms, which we're about to get to, will help you understand all the rods out there. Doesn't matter the company, you're gonna understand at least the baseline of what they're talking about, and you're gonna be able to choose what rod you wanna use for your different situations. Starting to rain. We're up here in the mountains right now, so it's been raining for the past like week again, back to being rainy. But it's a perfect time to explain this kind of stuff. So, rod action. It is defined by the speed of your rod. It goes from extra fast to moderate to slow. Beyond that, the speed of your rod, it also determines where your rod is going to bend. So an extra fast rod is going to bend way up at the tip, a fast rod a little bit farther down, a moderate rod more towards the middle, and a slow rod way down here at the bottom, it starts bending. The differences in these actions determine basically the sensitivity and how fast your rod responds to movement. So an extra fast rod, super duper sensitive. You're feeling every single little bump on that when it's casted out. You're feeling everything that moves around. If you want to hook set something, you just poop, little tap, and that hook is going to move fast. It's fast setting. It's a fast sensitivity. It's a fast action, extra fast action in that case. Moving down a little bit, fast. This is kind of the blank. Most shore fishing rods out there fall into the category of fast or moderate. For instance, this one here is an M, it's a moderate. These random ones I found, some of them are fast, most are moderate. That custom I have over there, that is a moderate. Most rods out there are moderate. It kind of sets you up for most things. You can do a little bit of whipping, you can do some bait fishing, you can do a little bit of both. You're gonna be finding most of them in these two categories, fast and moderate. The fast action rods Still got pretty good sensitivity. It's up there. Still giving you a good hook set, but it being a little bit more bendy towards the middle allows you to cast things a little bit farther than your extra fast rods, which bending just at the top takes away a little bit of that power you have in your casting. So a fast rod can cast a little bit farther typically than an extra fast rod, and it loses a little bit of sensitivity in that. These kind of rods, your fast action and your extra fast, these are more of your lure fishing rods or your dragging bait perhaps. You're not really using those rods for what we call in Hawaii dunking, which is sending out a piece of bait on a lead and letting it just hang out there until a fish comes and hit. If you're dunking or using some bait, you're gonna be looking for something more like a moderate action. With a moderate action, it gives you another little bump in your casting capabilities. The hook sets are really good for lures that have treble hooks. So if you are casting plugs, little baits, little shakers, something like that, you wanna look more towards the moderate end. If you rip a treble hook really fast, you might not hook set it, is what I've been told. So using the moderate ones gives you a little bit better action when you're casting those heavier lures. When you're casting things that have treble hooks on it, it lets you get it out there a little farther, and it lets you hook set better with treble hooks and things. Your fast action ones, typically you're using one hook, little straight shank kind of hooks. Whipping a grub maybe is what we call it in Hawaii. Whipping is just sending out a grub with a piece of lead in the middle and bringing it in. So this moderate one is a little bit more about plugging. Also, it's a little bit more about dunking as well. So if you're looking into dunking, you typically don't want the super fast rod. Again, super fast, you're getting a lot of sensitivity. When you're dunking out there, you're gonna be having your rod shake at every little piece of wind. All the waves that come through, your rod's gonna be constantly moving around. You're not gonna know, is that a fish? Is that just the wind, the waves? So if you have a more moderate action rod, you're gonna know it's a fish because it's gonna move and shake and your bell's gonna go off when it's something a little bit larger and it's not just your little tappy little, wind or wave. And then you go down to slow action. Slow action is pretty much what you're using on a boat. It's when you don't care about how fast you can set a hook. If you're trolling on a boat or you're bottom fishing, you're not worried too much about setting hooks. You're usually letting the fish come and bite the lure, set it by itself, and then it allows all that sponginess and the slowness of the slow action rod to absorb the fish hits. So you're not gonna really fish offshore too much with a slow action rod, the exception being some type of very large game fishing you might be doing off cliffs. Occasionally you'll find Aloha rods out there that are slow action, but again, they're mostly up in the moderate action. And you're definitely not gonna be casting lures with a slow action rod. You lose all of your casting distance with these slow action rods. It's kind of the opposite of this up here, where it's so whippy that you don't get much distance. The top is the only thing that's going around. The slow action rods are just so slow like that you aren't getting the strength out of the casts. So those are kind of for boat fishing, and also some fly fishermen love slow action rods. So I guess that's an exception. If you're a fly fisherman, you might be looking for those slow action rods out there because you want the whole rod to bend instead of just the top and super sensitive. Okay, that is a general understanding about action. Action is your speed. And then we move into power. Power is what most fishermen out there think of when they think of what kind of rod do I have. Power is defined by basically a scale going from ultralight down to heavy. So ultralight rods are your rods that are super flexible. There's almost no stiffness to them. Your power is defining how strong your rod is, how stiff it is. Ultralight rods are super flippy. They're what you use for really, really, really light game. Something like this would be a light action rod. You see how whippy and not stiff this rod is? This rod has light action to it. This is one of those instances where, depending on who you're talking to, you might get a little confused because oftentimes people will use power and action interchangeably. I at least know that I do. Up to this point, I would refer to these terms, the power terms, when I'm talking about the action of a rod, and vice versa. So going off the official terms, which is what I'm doing today, this is what rod companies out there defined everything by. I'm gonna tell you about the power now. So power of your rod is a scale that goes from ultralight down to heavy. And it's basically telling you how strong or how much power you can generate with the rod before something goes wrong. That power is directly translated into the pound test that your rod is going to recommend to you and the weight of your lure that it's going to recommend to you. Starting at an ultralight, this is what in Hawaii we call a whippy rod. It's a rod that has a lot of flex to it, almost no backbone if you want to call it. Something like this here, this would probably be a light rod. I don't have my ultralight with me right now, but this is a good example. I barely have to shake this and the rod is just whipping all over the place. It's a light action. I can contrast that with something like this one here, this Pin Prevail, which is a heavy action rod. The backbone on it is really strong. The lines test recommended, the amount of line that it's recommending for you is strong, and it's stiff. You see when I shake it, there's no flex. It's almost like a stick. It's heavy on the power scale down here. Typically they're gonna be thicker as well. So ultralight, really flexible whippy, light, still pretty whippy, medium, that's becoming a little bit more stiff. This rod here would be right in the middle. We'd call that a medium light. See that it has some whip to it, but it's also a little stiff. Moving up, medium heavy, that's your right in between heavy and medium. So in general, the lighter your rod, the lighter your game you're going to be targeting. The heavier your rod, the heavier your game. If you catch a really big fish with an ultralight rod, it's gonna feel gigantic. It's gonna be the battle of your life. And if it's a big fish, you're probably not gonna land it unless you're a total beast. Whereas if you catch a small fish on a heavy rod, you're probably not even gonna notice that the fish is on there. You wanna be hitting it with something like a light or an ultralight so that you can feel that fish fighting and it's actually fun. Your fishing style changes as well with your power. Your whipping rods are typically things like medium light, light, ultralight, and your dunking rods are things like medium, medium heavy, and heavy. So if you're out there tossing lures, you're whipping, you want to aim for something a little lighter on the scale. And if you're dunking, you're sending something out there, you just want it to sit, you want it to be strong for a big fish, you're gonna go down the line towards the heavier stuff. If you're going for something huge like Aloha, you want a super heavy action rod that's gonna be able to handle the giant fish you're about to catch. Sorry that it's a little noisy. Again, it's just been dumping rain for the last week. I've been trying to time this in between the rain, but it's just not happening right now, so we're just gonna roll on with it. So, we've covered your action, that's the speed. We've covered your power. That's your different levels of strength in the rod. If you want a really good analogy, imagine a seat belt. The action would be how fast that seatbelt clicks and locks in, and the power would be how strong that seatbelt pulls you to the chair. So if you want something to kick in really fast, you want it to be super sensitive, you go for the fast action. If you want it to be a little slower, less sensitive, you go slow. If you want something that's going to yoke fish in, boom, you go down for the heavy. If you want something that's more light, more fun, you go up and you hit something like an ultralight or a light. Typically, I'll stay away from ultralights unless I'm specifically ultralight fishing. That's gonna be stuff like 4 pound, 6 pound test. I fish mainly in this realm right here, the light to the medium heavy, with the exception of something like this, which is a heavy rod. One more thing to explain, this one's out there for you new fishermen that might be finding a rod in your garage, you wanna know what to do with it. We have different rod types. 3 rod types I'm gonna cover right now. Spinning rods, conventional / bait casting, and fly fishing. So a spinning rod is for a spinning reel. That's this type of reel right here. It spins. It's a spinning reel. A conventional or a bait casting rod is something like this. You're gonna be using a conventional reel or a bait casting reel, which I don't have an example of with me right now. And then a fly fishing rod is something like this. This doesn't have the right reel on it. I believe this is a fly fishing rod though. You use a fly fishing reel. It's a big round reel. It's used specifically for fly fishing. If you're just getting into fishing, I'd lean away from fly fishing because it's a little more hard to learn and do. You can see this has been sitting here for years and anybody's touched it. The difference in these rods comes from the way that they are set up. Spinning rods, when you're fishing with them, the eyes are facing down and the reel is facing down. A conventional or a bait casting rod is the exact opposite of this. When you're fishing with it, your eyes should be facing up and your reel should be facing up. The differences come when the manufacturer or whoever's making your rod sets it up. The rod itself is called the blank, and they are set to be flexing in a specific direction. So a spinning rod like this, you want everything facing down, the rod is going to bend down like that. Or if you're using a bait caster or a conventional, you got your eyes and your things setting up, so it's going to bend the other direction. It's going to bend that way. If you're out there and you really just don't have a choice, you have a conventional rod and a spinning reel, you can throw them on there and it'll work, but you're going to lose a lot of your casting ability, and you're also in danger of things breaking if you get a big fish on there. And that third one here, the fly fishing rod, the easiest way to notice a fly fishing rod is because the butt down here is going to be really short. You'll see like this is a spinning rod. Where my reel sits, we're missing like a foot of rod. That's because these are meant to be used with one hand. You're fishing like that, and you're using your other hand to manipulate the string. Whereas with conventional and spinning rods, they're longer because you want to manipulate them with two hands like this. Now that we've covered action, we've covered power, we're into the types. We have a general understanding of what a fly fishing rod is. Now we can talk about the differences between spinning rods and conventional bait casting rods. This is directed more towards people who might be finding a fishing rod at a garage sale, finding one in a garage like this. I don't know any garage in the world that doesn't have a fishing pole laying somewhere in the back of the depths. So now you got that pole and you're trying to tell, is this a conventional rod or is this a spinning rod? And there's a few hints on poles that can kind of lead us in the right direction in determining which way those poles might be. Again, the easiest way is if your pole tells you. Let's take a look at this pole here. This one happens to have all of its writing like scraped off because it's so old. So we're not going to be able to tell just by looking at the labeling what type of pole this is. If this reel wasn't here, it might not be immediately noticeable to us that it's also obviously for, probably a conventional rod. It's got an old conventional reel on it. That's a good hint. But there are a few things on the poles when they're made that can tip off which way this pole is leaning. Is it a conventional or is it a spinning? The easiest way to find that out is by checking out the eyes of the pole. On spinning rods, because the pressure of the line is pulling down directly on the eyes, whereas in a conventional, it's pushing up onto the pole, there has to be a lot more eyes on spinning rods. And typically, the eyes are going to be set not equidistant from each other. So in this example, this is a spinning rod. This is the top half of that spinning rod we've been looking at. You can see that as you're moving up the pole, these eyes are getting closer and closer and closer together until up here it's only a few inches. Let's take a look at this conventional rod. Here we can see there's only 5 eyes to begin with. That's about the same as the top right there on this pole, the top 2 feet. So there's a very small number of eyes. Also, for the majority of the pole, these eyes are spread almost equidistant from each other, with the exception of this top one here, which is still pretty far apart. Because there's not many eyes on this pole, because they're set in general pretty equidistant from another, we can infer that this is probably a conventional rod. So we know in likelihood this is a conventional. Let's take a look at this one over here, try to figure out what this one is. Well, there's not that many eyes, 6 on this one, but we do have a pretty good change in how far apart these eyes are spread. We got about a hand's width, a little more than that, down to double hand's width, down to a little bit over double hand's width. So if I had to guess, this is probably a spinning rod. Again, best thing we could do is look here, see what it says. This doesn't directly tell us what it is. It does, however, give us some information that if we wanted to do a little research, it'd be easy to find out. This is a master custom black and a serial number. If you type all that into Google, 9 times out of 10, you'll get a listing for one of these old rods, and it's gonna tell you what kind of rod it is, hopefully. So if I had to assume what kind of rod this was, I would say this is probably a spinning rod. One final obvious giveaway that your rod is either a conventional or a bait casting rod is the rod will have on the opposite side of the seat a little trigger like this. I'll show a picture of it. I don't have the right rod with me right now to show you what I mean, but there's a little protrusion that looks like a trigger that's intended for you to hold the rod like that. If your rod has one of those little protrusions, it's almost guaranteed to be a bait casting rod. Okay, now that we've covered the action, how sensitive your rod is, how fast it is, we covered the power, how strong it is, we've gone over the different types. We're gonna take a look at 3 of these random poles that I don't know very much about that we just found a little while ago, and we're gonna try to determine what kind of action they have, what kind of power they have, and by doing that, kind of give a good guesstimate on what kind of fishing you wanna be doing with the rods. So we'll start with this little boy right here. First thing you wanna do, hope that there's some writing on it to tell you what it is. Oh, this one has something on there. So this is 6 foot, line recommendation 4 to 10, lure weight 1/8 to 3/8 ounce. From that, these weight definitions, we can infer the power of the rod at least. Probably gonna be right here in the light area. A good tip for everybody out there in the future, when you're checking your fishing rods, you're in the store or something, best way to do it is to just grab the top and push down like this. Never grab it and bend it. Don't like jam it up into the ceiling or something. Just push down like this with your hand and you can feel, look where it's bending. If you grab it and just start pulling it like this, there's a way higher chance than you might imagine of you just snapping the rod there. We can take a little tap of it. It's got some whippiness to it. That confirms it's probably in the light area. It's not super whippy like an ultralight, but it does have some whip. And I just hit a light, so I should probably move forward. So if I had to guess, I'd say this is probably a light power rod. We can take a look at the action now, try to guess that. If it's a shorter pole like this, we can just reach on up and again push down on the top, see where it's bending. It's bending at the top third, not at the very top though. It starts bending right about here, this section of the pole. So I'd assume that it's probably in the fast action. It's not all the way at the top like an extra fast. It's definitely not in the middle like a moderate. It's probably right here in between extra fast and fast. I'd say it's probably fast. Now we know the power. It's probably light. We know the sensitivity. It's probably about fast. I'd say that this is probably a pretty good rod to be using whipping. I'd be using some small lures with this rod. I'd be using straight hooks. I'd be dragging it through the water, and the sensitivity of the rod's gonna let me know if there's a fish that bites it. I can quickly hook set it. I know that the light action is gonna give me a little bit more fun if it's a small fish. If it's a huge fish, I'm probably not gonna be able to handle it, but any kind of medium fish is gonna be okay. So I kind of have an idea of what kind of fish I wanna target with that rod, and I have an idea of what kind of fishing I wanna be doing, which would be lure fishing. I wouldn't wanna be dunking with this rod. I wouldn't wanna be doing static fishing where I'm sending it out, just having it sit there with a piece of lead, because this thing is very sensitive with a fast action. Every little wave or anything that just barely touches it is gonna cause this pole to tweak out, and you're not gonna know what is going on, if it's a fish, if it's just waves or wind. So I would stay away from doing that sort of fishing. And with this rod, it'd be pretty much perfect to be doing a little bit of whipping, sending out some small leads and grubs, and catching fish using that method. Beat it! You done?
Did I spook you?
No, you derped me. All right, let's take a look at this big, long rod right here. First thing we wanna do, information. No real information on that, but we can do some things to infer what kind of rod this is. Let's check out the power first. This thing is stiff, but it's still got a little bit of flex into it. It's a little bouncy. It's not like I'm whipping just a log or a stick. It definitely has a little bit of bounce. So, a stiff rod, but still retaining a little bit of that whippiness. We can kind of infer that the power is most likely in the medium range. perhaps towards the medium high range. I wouldn't say it's medium light, it's definitely not light. I'd probably say medium heavy. We'll just get an idea of what kind of action we have here. With one of these longer poles, it's a lot harder to bend it properly. You gotta kind of go up, bend it, stick it over to something. It's bending relatively high up, but it's got a nice arc to it. That means it's probably bending right about here, about a third the way down the pole. So, power, most likely medium heavy to medium. Action, fast action is what I'd say this probably is. It's not bending way down here, it's not bending way at the tip. Fast action. Again, most rods out there in general are made fast action nowadays. This is an older rod, but it's still, I'd assume, that's probably fast action. What do we want to be doing with this? Power, we got medium heavy. That's starting to hit into our dunking realm. So I'd say probably dunking would be an appropriate thing to do with this rod. Action, we have a fast action, so we could still cast lures with this rod. We have a decent amount of sensitivity, but it's not quite as high as something in the extra fast action realm. And it might be leaning a little bit more towards the moderate. It's probably somewhere right in between these two, fast and moderate. It definitely does have a little bit of sensitivity to it though. You can feel that any movements with this and you're starting to pick it up. So what I'd say this rod would be good for is your right in between of casting large lures and dunking. You could cast some larger lures with this thing and it'd be appropriate, or you could dunk with this and it'd still be appropriate. If I was being picky, I'd say this rod's touching on the little bit too sensitive range, the range where it's gonna start picking up on waves and wind way too easily, but it's still, you got an action that's slow enough that it's gonna work just fine if you're just picking this out dunking and you wanna have some fun. You're not gonna have to worry. This rod would work for you. It still has enough power and that action isn't so slow that you could cast some lures with this and you could still blast them out pretty dang far. This is actually a really good little caster rod. You could whack things out really far with this thing. So if I was recommending what to do with this rod, we know action, somewhere around here, moderate and fast. Power, somewhere around medium heavy. I'd probably do dunking and I'd probably do casting lures. I would not do whipping light lures and I wouldn't try to do anything along the realm of like casting out small things. I'd be doing dunking or large lures with this exclusively. All right, let's talk about one more rod right here. Try to see, nothing on there. We can't infer anything off the information because there is no information. So we're gonna have to use what we learned to figure out what you wanna do with this thing. First thing I realized, the action on this is super slow. Look where this rod is starting to bend. It's starting to bend pretty far down, almost halfway down the rod. It's starting to bend right about here, picking up a lot towards the top. We can also do a little bit of whippy test. This thing is pretty dang whippy. It's up in the light area. It bends a little bit lower down, so the action's probably in the moderate realm, but the power is a little bit more towards the light end. So this is a pretty good contrast between this rod. All right, so this rod is kind of in a weird limbo state. The action is heading down here into the moderate. It's light power, so it creates a very weird dynamic. What would you want to do with this thing? Well, the action is definitely too slow for me to be wanting to do any kind of whipping with this. I wouldn't want to whip with this. I wouldn't want to try to cast little lures with this. I wouldn't be able to cast it very far at all. And there'd be no sensitivity in me bringing that in. I would have no idea what's going on out there. And the lure would just be getting kind of chugged along as this slow rod drags this bait through the water. But the power would infer that you would kind of want to be doing whipping with this because it's up here in the more light to medium light range. Don't want to dunk with this because it's too light power, but we don't want to whip with this because it's too slow action. What I guess this pole is probably used for was this thing came off of a boat. Somebody would use this as sit down, cast down to the bottom, wait for something, slowly pull it up, and then crank this thing back up to the surface. This would be a good boat rod, but this would be a pretty poor shore fishing rod. You wouldn't have much fun with this. You'd be struggling to cast anything. You'd be struggling to do any sort of lure game. And if you were to try to dunk with this, you'd be struggling to feel or know if anything's on there. Out of these rods we found today, this would be the last choice I would take out fishing on the shore, but maybe the first choice that I'd take out fishing on a boat. It's almost perfectly set up for something like that. One note I'd like to add, in this video, I'm talking about two different types of fishing, primarily whipping and dunking. I'm making recommendations of bait fishing towards the dunking end, but you can fish with bait in a more whipping style towards the more light end of the power range. For instance, you can use light pound tackle, light power rods, and you can still send out a piece of bait on one of those rods, have it hanging out there, and wait for a fish to hit it. In that instance though, you're probably going to want to be holding the rod the whole time, and you're going to want to wait and hook set it yourself. Whereas the dunking method I'm referring to, you're sending out a piece of bait, you're letting it just soak out there, and you're leaving it inside of a pole holder and letting it just do its own thing until a fish hits it and hooks itself. So you can bait fish with the lighter power ones. I don't want to be insinuating that it's impossible, but it's a little bit more high maintenance. You're going to be wanting to hold it, you want to wait, and you want to hook set it yourself. Whereas in dunking, it's more of just let it sit out there and you're not worrying too much about hook set until something actually bites it. The sensitivity of those light ones does aid for that kind of fishing. You can sit out there with that in your hand and you can feel when the fish is biting it, and you can hook set the fish yourself. Hopefully we just covered everything you need to know when you're out there buying a fishing rod, when you're finding a rod that might be hidden away in a garage somewhere. And if you don't have it written on there and what it is, now you can kind of determine what the rod is, what it's used for, what the action is, what the power is, and what the type is. Hopefully that gives you guys a little bit more knowledge out there, will allow you to decide what you want to use when you're fishing. If you have any questions, I'm always available in the comments. If you have any recommendations or things you want to bring up to my attention, please drop it in there too. I'm always learning as well. I learned a lot of things through the comment section of these videos and people spreading a little bit of knowledge to me, so always open. And a final thing to touch on again, depending on where you are in the world, they might not call these the exact same things. They might be calling the power the action, the power. This one's almost always the same, the type. But now that you know these two, you at least have an idea about what people are talking about and what's going on with your rods. I'm gonna take all these notes, I'll take a quick photo of them, I'll post a link to them. So if you in the future want to check this out and kind of relate it to what you're doing in a garage or in a store, you have at least a little bit of resources to help you out with that. In addition, these things are written all over the internet in one way or another, so there's many sources you can get this information from. Here's just one choice. Final thing I want to do is give a little shout out to two people that helped me out in the making of this video. That's Tom of American Town Custom Rods and Darren of American Tackle Company. Thank you both for the help you guys gave me and a quick little rundown on these different terms, getting me a little bit of clarity that I could hopefully pass on. Alright everybody, thanks for watching. Hope that helped you guys a little bit. And until the next one, da-douche!